Hello, I am Pastor Michelle Holloway, serving the Baker and Haynes United Methodist Churches in Baker City and Haynes, Oregon. This message is for August 8th, and we are continuing on in finding grace in Genesis. This week we're looking at chapters 22 through 26. I'm hoping by now, here on the fourth Sunday of this series, that you're all getting an idea of what it's like to look for God's grace, God's unswerving favor in situations that seem hopeless and seem like tragedies or punishment on the surface. It is my hope and prayer that by the time we're finished with this series, you'll be able to take what you have learned about seeing God's grace and apply it to the various circumstances of your own lives. God's grace encompasses us all, and even in the midst of upheaval and pain, God is present with us just as God was present with the patriarchs and matriarchs of the stories we've been studying. Last Sunday, we ended our journey with the birth of a baby whose name means laughter. Now we continue on into stormy territory of challenging faith. Faith and trust will be tested in ways that no one should ever have to experience. Abraham was finally the recipient of the promise made to him by God, and Isaac, the boy named Laughter, was the gift. Now, God challenged Abraham beyond what any father should have to do. I've always struggled with this story of Abraham and Isaac and sacrifice. I really dislike the idea that this loving God, who had done everything possible to establish a relationship with humans and had made a covenant with Abraham, would ask such a terrible thing. So there must be something more that we don't know about. God had promised Abraham that God would be God to him and his descendants for all generations. But Abraham lived in Canaan and was surrounded by Canaanites, who were pagans. They sacrificed their children to pagan gods. Abraham witnessed this. There were sacrifices because of the drought and famine, and one or two children sacrificed for the sake of the rest of the family must have made sense. Not only was it believed that the pagan gods would be appeased and would bring rain and food, but if it didn't work, then there were fewer mouths to feed. The children always died, and the drought didn't end. So, what message was God trying to give to Abraham? As the story unfolds, Abraham and Isaac were traveling to the land of Moriah. For context, Abraham was at least 120 or more, and Isaac was anywhere from 20 to 30 years old. That information changes our image of this story, doesn't it? Abraham had brought with him 2 young slaves and a donkey. He loaded up supplies, including wood for the fire he would build on the altar. They journeyed for 3 days until they came to the place God had told Abraham to go. Then Abraham told the 2 young men to stay behind, and he and Isaac went on alone. Isaac carried the wood for the altar, and Abraham carried the fire and the knife. Isaac questioned his father as to why there wasn't a lamb. And it is here that we find one of the most wonderful phrases in all of scriptures, a phrase that transcends time and space and circumstances. God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. God never told Abraham that there would be anything else available to sacrifice other than Isaac. Abraham knew that the children of the pagans were never rescued. So, what on earth was going through Abraham's mind at this point? Would this be different than all the other sacrifices he had witnessed? Isaac was the child of the promise. He was the covenant between God and Abraham. God will provide. The power of this story comes not only in Abraham's faith in God that his son would be spared, but also in the faith Isaac had in his father. He trusted Abraham completely, even to the point of being bound, laid on the altar on top of the wood, and having his father standing over him, holding the knife ready to make the first cut. What kind of trust goes beyond what most of us could ever imagine? Would we trust God with the life of our only child? Now, view this scene through Isaac's eyes. He was on a journey with his father, the father who loved him and he loved in return. They had spent many days together, and there was safety for Isaac being with Abraham. He had watched the preparations, loading the supplies on the donkey, having his dad place the wood on his back to carry, seeing his father with rope and fire. They traveled for 3 days, Isaac not exactly knowing what they were doing, but enjoying being out with his father. They had been on many such excursions over the years, and it was always a joy for father and son to be together. In his life, had he experienced God's grace? Did he know what it would look like? Or was he simply putting all his trust in the word of his father that God would provide? Abraham laid out the wood as Isaac watched and wondered what was going to be sacrificed, still trusting his father, who trusted God. Then Isaac stood there as his father tied him up. What was going on here? Did he struggle? Did he beg his father to stop? Isaac felt himself being lifted by his father and placed on the altar. He could feel the sticks and larger pieces of wood poking him in the back. Then he watched his father draw out a sharp sword and hold it above him. At what point would we have given up trusting our Father and trusting God and said, "That's it, I'm out of here"? When God's favor happens before the moment of desperation, when it's an immediate response, then we don't have the opportunity to actually practice our faith. It's in those times when grace is deferred that we grow in our understanding of God's immense compassion for us. When we are standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to tumble head first, and God brings us through, then we have completed a journey and have learned so much more about God and who we are in that relationship. If God rescues us when things are easy, we will never learn how to make it through the difficult times without giving up hope. Isaac went to the edge of the cliff, and God was proven to be faithful. God did provide an animal to take Isaac's place. Isaac was right to trust his father, and Abraham was right to trust his God. Among all the things we can learn from this, there is one outstanding lesson. The God of Abraham, Noah, Sarah, Isaac, and the rest was not like the pagan gods. The pagan gods couldn't do anything, but the people continued to offer up sacrifices in the hope that something would change. This God, Abraham's God, had the power to change circumstances, to save, to heal, to bring about miracles. And this was the God who had made a covenant to always be Abraham's God. That's incredibly life-changing. Abraham was shown without a doubt that the God he worshiped, the God who favored and approved of him, was the one true God who would always provide. Do we believe this? Do we have the unwavering trust that God will provide for us in all the journeys of our lives? Even when the situations aren't as extreme, do we trust God and see God's grace in action? God's grace was evident, and Abraham was right to trust. Our faith tradition teaches us that God not only provided an animal to take the place of Isaac, to be the salvation for Isaac, but that God has provided a lamb for the salvation of all of humanity. It's part of God's grace and approval of humanity, and it shows once again that God was and is working on our behalf. It is God who makes this all work out. As the title of this message shows, this is the eye of the storm. There have been many stormy times before and stormy times ahead, but for the moment, it's calm. Has anyone here actually experienced the eye of a storm? They are common with tornadoes and hurricanes, where everything is being blown to bits and then a sudden, eerie calm settles over the land. Everyone knows that the storm isn't over, but respite is given. A little breather is offered before the next layer of turmoil and destruction comes rolling through. There are some people who thrive on upheaval and don't know how to live in the calm. They want to be out in the storm, being tested and tried, and if things are too smooth, they will create problems. And we will see this in next week's message. The problems give meaning and purpose to some, and they can only live in the chaos. Personally, I want the calm. I want to be able to see the storm off in the distance and get out of the way of it if possible. I like the eye of the storm, but the storm will continue to move through, and if we're not prepared, the eye will give us a false sense of security where we forget to trust God, which isn't good, because we will need God when the other side of the storm begins to move in. It's like Isaac, trusting that God's favor will be poured out in his most desperate moment. God could have stepped in any time and shown them the ram caught in the bushes. But Isaac wouldn't have learned about weathering the storm that came at the end of their calm 3-day journey, and it wouldn't have been much of a test of Abraham's faith. There was a lot more to this particular study in the book of Genesis on the Genesis of grace. But this seems to be the strongest part in this particular chapter regarding God's grace. If we move to the end of this section, we're at a point where Isaac is married to Rebekah. For 20 years, they were without children, and every day Isaac prayed for her. Finally, she became pregnant with twins. The two babies wrestled inside of her, and she wished she was dead. But God assured her that two great nations would come from these boys, Esau and Jacob. We will finish our journey in grace next week. Things to consider and remember. God's grace is never withheld, but it might be delayed or deferred. Don't give up hope. God's grace and approval are inclusive of all humanity. God did not withdraw grace from Cain when he murdered his brother, but offered him a mark of protection. Hagar, The Egyptian slave girl was part of the covenant, even though she wasn't part of Abraham's tribe. We're never too old or too young to be recipients of God's favor. Just look at Sarah and Ishmael. Grace abounds. It's a good message to remember and to share with others. Amen.